Our topic today is Scrum and Kanban sitting in a tree. And our speaker comes to us with 35 years worth of experience. Would you please help me welcome Halim Dunsky.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's interesting to hear John refer to me as having 35 years worth of experience. I've got those years of experience. You'll help decide on your own whether you think it's been worth it. I've been with the Agile consulting firm Solutions IQ for about the last 7.5 years, and in that period I've worked in Scrum, worked in Kanban, and worked in organizational change, helping companies adapt their operations to the Agile methods that they want to employ. Before we go any further, I'd like to find out a little bit about who you all are. So can I see a show of hands? How many of you identify primarily as developers? And how about primarily as testers or QA? All right, now how many have your primary identification as both? Not so many. We're looking to see a little bit more convergence of this, of course, as time goes on. Tell me also about your experience with Kanban and Scrum. How many of you have been on a Scrum team for a year or more? Raise them high. 5 years? Not so many. A couple. How about Kanban? Longer than a year? A little bit. And how many of you have been on a team that was using both Scrum and Kanban at the same time? Got one here, small handful. How about in an organization where you had some teams doing one, some doing another? A little bit more prevalent. All right, we're going to explore today a little bit of the fundamentals and give you an idea of how these frameworks can support each other. I'm going to start out by talking about some of the ways in which both of these as Agile workflow frameworks share common attributes. Talk a little bit about how these workflow factors can contribute to software quality. More specifically then, an introduction to Scrum and Kanban, and then we're going to take a look at some factors that might guide you to choose one or the other, depending on the circumstances of your company and your workflow. And then we're going to talk about some mixed models where we have Scrum and Kanban being used together in various configurations to meet different sorts of workflow needs. I want to make one further comment before I continue, if I can avoid hanging myself here. Workflow and engineering. These are two other things that ought to be sitting in a tree together. Focus for today is about workflow methods, but I want to be really clear, it is not my contention that you can get where you need to go by just upping your game on managing workflow. The high quality of software engineering is really critical, and to me that typically means the XP methods. If there's a better way than XP, I haven't really found it. But in any case, that's pretty well outside of scope for today. By the way, is there anybody in this room who can not complete this little child's rhyme? Scrum and Kanban. That's right, K-I-S-S-I-N-G. And I want to see engineering and workflow in that same tree. As Scrum Kanban guy, I can't get by without my blue tape. So here are my little blue lines for the blue tape, but I'm not going to be pulling these things across the board today. You get the idea. All right, let's get started on the workflow frameworks. Now, I said I'm going to talk about my remote clicker. You get ready, and you get ready, and you get ready. And at the end of the day, you're not ready. That's right. Boom. All right. So I told you I was going to talk about the ways in which these two frameworks are similar. But first, I want to make sure that we all clearly understand the main difference. Scrum is oriented to iterations. There's a regular heartbeat life cycle of events that happen, and we're going to review a little bit of what that looks like. In contrast, Kanban is a continuous flow process. The items come in at the beginning, they go along the assembly line, and they drop off at the end. Now, if you look very closely, you'll find flow in Scrum, and you'll find iteration in Kanban. But as far as the primary organizing metaphor, this is the difference between these two systems. But let's talk about some of the ways in which they're the same. First of all, they're both pull-oriented systems. This is in contrast to a management-directed push system where management tells you what to do next, or an assembly line where the next piece comes along the belt at you whether you're ready for it or not. These systems are both pull-oriented systems, and it's the team's responsibility to say when they're ready for the next bit. Both systems rest on explicit process policies. Now in Kanban, they're called process policies. This is the set of agreements that define when an item is ready to move from one stage to the next in the process. In Scrum, we have something called definition of done, which defines the quality standards that the team holds themselves to in assessing the completeness of each piece of work before they claim that it's finished. These are both examples of process policies. Both frameworks support both incremental and iterative work. Incremental, of course, is adding a piece at a time. In this example, we're adding another inch of stem and another leaf, and another inch of stem and another leaf. But the original leaves remain pretty much unchanged once they are grown. In contrast, an iterative process takes something that's simple and gradually enhances and refines it over time until it reaches the full richness. Now, I'm going to do a little sidebar here to talk about how these two methods are used. This example from fastmonkey.com shows the difference between two approaches that you might take in delivering a minimum viable product. The top example, you build a wheel. Then you maybe frame up some wheels together, then you add a chassis to it, and you add a top to it, maybe an engine. And all the way along the line, you got nothing usable until you get to the picture on the right. That's incremental. It may be a good way to build, but it's not a good way to do market testing, which is what viable product is all about. On the bottom, you've got transportation from day one. And iteratively, the product is improved and enhanced and enriched, and you've got something usable all the way along the line. That's iterative. Let's go back to the common features of Kanban and Scrum. And the final item that I want to list here is this idea of continuous improvement, or Kaizen. Kaizen is a Japanese word. It refers to continuous incremental small steps of improvement, and it's built into the culture of both Kanban and Scrum. The idea that the team learns how to improve their process, and of course it also refers to improving the product that's being developed. All right, so in essence, both of these frameworks can be expressed in just a small number of fairly simple principles. First of all, you break the work up into small batches. And whether this is the individual user story, which, by the way, how many of you are using user stories? Yeah, fairly prevalent. How many of you feel that your teams have gotten pretty good at user stories? Not so many. So it's easy to learn, and it's difficult to learn to do well, like a lot of this stuff. So you break the work into small pieces, and as I said, that may be the individual user stories, and the individual small unit of work is an important factor in Scrum and in Kanban. In Scrum, of course, you also have the small batch of work that's in each sprint plan. This is another way of reducing the interval between deliveries. In both systems, it's important to prioritize. In Kanban, in some cases, you'll be working a first in, first out queue of service tickets or defects. In other cases, you're building software. Just as in Scrum, it's important to be building the most important stuff first. That way you know that if you run out of resources, you run out of time or money, you have to stop. You have built the best possible thing in that period of time. Visualizing the workflow is a critical element. You've seen, all of you, in your Scrum boards or your Kanban boards, this is a way to have a visual representation of what's going on. Team can see it, people walking by in the hall or who have access to the tool can see it. How many of you are using electronic tools for your task boards? How many of you are using paper wall-based task board systems? Right, so we see very much fewer of these. The tools have their large value when you have teams that are distributed, when you have people across the company who need access to the same base of data. The paper systems on the wall, I don't know, there's something about the tactile quality of actually moving those stickies from one page to another. You're smiling, you've seen that, right? It has a lot of value as well. So I would encourage you, learn your system on paper if possible first. Limit multitasking. Multitasking is evil. We've learned that. There's a lot of noise in the culture about our value is increased, the more things we can do all at the same time. But in fact, research shows that it ain't so. It's expensive, it's error prone, and the amount of throughput that you can drive through a system is reduced if you try to do that. So both Scrum and Kanban have their approaches to supporting the teams in limiting multitasking. We'll talk about that a little further. Deliver frequently. Whether you're delivering an individual story off the end of your Kanban flow or an individual story to the product owner within your sprint, or whether you're delivering batches of work to your stakeholders at the end of a sprint, or whether you're talking about more frequent releases to your end user, whether that's an outside customer or an inside corporate user, same principle. Deliver more often. This allows for shortening the feedback loop, which is a huge foundation for the value that these frameworks can deliver. We'll talk about that a little further as well. Immediate feedback supported by that frequent delivery. Working together as a self-organizing team. We find that although software is about technology, building software is about people. It's a human process. And if we can learn to work effectively together in environments with values that support the effective process, very, very exceptional results can be delivered. Be good to each other. One of the things that we learned in kindergarten, maybe we didn't learn everything we needed to know in kindergarten, but that was one of the lessons that I think has proven to be a good one. All right. So I would like to talk next about some of the ways that this workflow management stuff can impact quality. I mean, after all, it's not about the code itself. Quality is baked into the code. Why should this stuff matter? Well, I think it does, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why. Two kinds of doing. Many of you have seen this pair of ideas. Doing the right thing means building the software that will meet the needs, and doing the thing right means building it at the level of quality that's appropriate. There are a lot of different ways to parse the space of what is software quality. I don't want to get into a long discussion about that. Here's one example from software fundamentals, software testing fundamentals. This is a list of items that you can use to assess the quality of the work that you're doing. I think it's a pretty good list. All of the ilities are here. You can probably think of some others to add. Personally, I would add timeliness. And then I want to point out the following. Functionality is the one item on this list that refers most directly to doing the right thing. All the rest of these things have to do with doing the thing right. And we'll talk a little bit later on about how the process policies embody a culture of doing the thing right. But how do you get all of this stuff with workflow methods? Let's talk about small batch size, first of all. Small, well-defined units of work, such as user stories, is the foundational underpinning of getting any sort of good results at all out of these systems. Why is that? Well, a user story, if it's done right, can be easier to understood than a piece pulled out of a complex, large specification. Any of you still having to deal with writing software from large specifications? Good, wonderful. A little bit, maybe. Why is it? Well, I think that first of all, you break it up in little pieces. A spec broken in pieces can be a lot like a big piece of software broken in pieces. You have a modular specification, you have modularity in your software, and I think they're for very similar reasons. So along the same lines, can you imagine trying to run the United States without states? If all you had was a federal government and one big undemarcated space in between, it would be extremely difficult. You break the spec down in pieces, you can look to have qualities that resemble the qualities you look for in well-modularized software. High coupling, low cohesion, well-defined interfaces. Some of the stuff explicitly appears in the guidelines you see about writing good user stories. In the INVEST principle, for example, the very first one is independent. Well, there's your low coupling. And because people who work with user stories in planning are encouraged to always be paying attention to dependencies, so this helps support the idea of the interfaces being maintained between the concepts in the spec. I'm also going to contend that when you work from a well-designed base of user stories like this, it's going to support you in developing code that is well modularized as well. Now, this isn't something that I can document from research, but I think I've seen it happen more than once. Does that sound like a plausible idea to you? I'm seeing some heads nodding. Focus on working software. One of the principles in the Agile Manifesto. Working software is the measure of progress. So let's talk about delivery. Not only are we writing our specs in small pieces, we're focusing on delivering small units of working, tested software. This stuff is meant to be achieving production quality in small increments and at short intervals. And if you do it right, your code base will be nearly continuously functional. This makes it a lot easier if you've got multiple teams bumping elbows in the same space, complex enterprise environments. It's very important to keep the code base close to functional at all times. Talk about production quality code. What's going on in there? Quality standards. I mentioned the definition of done and the process policies. It's also a matter of building a culture of shared responsibility. This is baked into the idea of how a Kanban team is meant to operate with each other day after day. It's baked into the idea of how a Scrum team is meant to be talking to each other every day at stand-ups and at the end of every sprint during their retrospectives. It's about culture, people coming to understand that this is how we do things around here. Early testing. I don't have to tell you that it's cheaper to fix a defect if you find it earlier than if you find it later. And a lot of the emphasis in these methods is about bringing testing earlier and earlier up into the process. If you have ever come to the end of a release and then had to spend a lot of time doing hardening, you know that that's waste in your flow. I worked at a telco. I was a Scrum Master for one of several teams working on a system that delivered software for customers to order telephone handsets. And one of the first things that I did was to look at the standard calendar. They have what they call a walk-back calendar for each quarterly release. And I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I looked at it again. In this 13-week quarter, the last 6 weeks was all regression and integration. So the development period was limited to almost as low as 50% of the total. That last 6 weeks, they had to do that because they didn't have a better way. They couldn't test, they didn't have automated tests. This is an organization, I was asked to look at a test plan on behalf of the QA group. At this point, this particular company had separate QA, separate test teams, and they were just beginning the practice of assigning individual QA people to sit with the development teams that they were trying to support. But they were still very deep in their old practices about test development. They handed me a plan to review and comment on. 2,000 pages of manual test instructions, loaded with copy and paste errors, loaded with inadequate descriptions. There's no way that could possibly have succeeded, and of course it didn't. I'll tell you a little more about that company maybe a little later. In any case, so to the extent that you can learn to do more and more of that testing effectively, story by story, you reduce that tax, which slows down everything that you're trying to do. Lag. A lot of you maybe were here yesterday to hear Hillel's presentation. He did a wonderful job of focusing on the daemon lag. This is the characteristic whereby everything you try to do to observe and correct your system is hampered, because by the time you get through measuring the data and then digesting it, it's too late. The system has moved on to somewhere else. Think about a thermostat. Thermostat, in the old days, an analog system, measuring continuously what the actual temperature in the room was compared to the set point. So you had a continuous ability to correct the temperature. Today, most thermostats are digital. There's a sampling interval. How often do you suppose those systems are testing the current temperature relative to the set point? Well, I don't know. Probably they're not doing it every picosecond. That wouldn't be efficient, but I'm sure they're doing it more often than once an hour, right? So by working in small batches, as we talked about earlier, that sampling interval gets smaller and smaller. It becomes possible to have a tighter control loop. This is old line cybernetics. There's nothing new here. In this kind of agile development, we start by building the simplest thing that can possibly work and then improve it in bits. The release cycles are shorter, means it gets out to the customer faster. You learn sooner whether the product is going to fly. Sometimes you tackle this explicitly in a lean startup frame of mind: build, measure, learn. And you try to do that quickly, whether it's A/B testing or whether it's testing a proof of concept on a new product idea. Build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn. The faster you can make those cycles, the quicker your opportunity to achieve a closer product market fit. Stakeholder participation is continuous. You want to see the product owner with the delivery team every day, sitting with them if possible, attending their stand-up every day if possible, being there online and available in person to answer questions as often as needed. It helps control the drift, it helps make mid-course corrections, and it helps you deliver a product that is better suited to what the underlying intent is. At the end of every sprint, or at other intervals that may be useful to you in Kanban, you're not only going to show it to the product owner, you're going to show it to your larger stakeholder community, who may also have very important feedback that helps guide the evolution of the work. Is this all making sense? YAGNI. Who knows what that means? Somebody call it out. You ain't going to need it. So the idea here is that the most cost-effective software is a software you don't even build in the first place. It's, on the one hand, it's not doing what some large vendors of large bloated applications do, building features that rarely get used. And on the other end, it's considerations like if you haven't built it, it's not in there in the code base and it doesn't have to be maintained. So your cost of dealing with it over time is also reduced. Or something that was valuable that you've stopped using, and you know how useful it is to clear that stuff out, right? If you ain't going to need it, don't have it in the code base. And if you're doing it right, if you're not living in an organization that's trying to jam as much work as possible into every release, then it may ease back on the pressure a little bit. You may not be these days very often in a situation where you have to do death marches. Maybe a lot of organizations are past that, although I know some of my clients aren't. Death march in the last year, anybody? Yeah, a little bit. So even in the absence of a death march, though, you often have a lot of pressure. And you may get to the end of the period, you get your code freeze date, and you have passed your tests. Yay! But you lift up the hood, and you wouldn't want to smell what's underneath on a hot day, right? So reducing the amount of work that you're trying to jam in can help a great deal in reducing the pressures that lead to that kind of corner cutting. And stop when it makes sense. We've heard horror stories about large-scale government contracting. There are all kinds of pressures in that sort of environment because it's difficult to get funding. It's maybe hard to get $500 million allocated to build a piece of work that you want to build, but it's harder to get $50 million approved 10 times. That's why that doesn't happen like that. It's a difficult problem that I don't know how to solve. But in our environments, where we have a little bit of a closer communication loop between the engineering and the product marketing and the management communities, it may be possible to educate corporate leadership about how to manage investment in smaller increments on shorter time scales. That can support the idea of you get 80% of the value from the first 20% of the software that you build, you can stop and move on to the next thing. Here's another example, minimum viable product. Many of you may have been in a situation where you have product owners, stakeholder community, give you a list that's this long, and they say, this is what we have to have in our release. And you look at it, and you estimate it, and you crank through the release forecast based on your velocity, and you say, well, if you want it at the end of November, we can only give you this much. And they look at what's left and they run around screaming with their hair on fire. If you're lucky, it contributes to a negotiation. Eventually, you settle on something. They swap some stuff in and out. You end up with a plan. And then somebody's going to say, but this stuff that's left over, we're going to do it next, right? And somebody else will say, we never do that stuff next. You cut it out of release 1, it never sees the light of day. That may be the right thing. It may mean that the organization cannot stay focused on priorities, or it may be that the organization is good at responding to the priorities which we know will change. So, just from that situation, you can't tell if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but I can guarantee you it may make exact, perfect, and total sense to never build that other stuff that didn't fit into release 1. I want to hit this one again because I think it's so important. Can you just have a kinesthetic moment to soak in that calligraphy? That's all I want to say about that right now. I'm a liar. I'm going to say something else. I don't know enough Japanese grammar to know whether this is better translated as change is good, or maybe it just refers to the good type of change. Not all change is equally good. Agile methods meant to give us the ability to be responsive, but it doesn't mean that every stupid flavor of the week that comes along the line is the right thing to drop what we're doing and to pick up instead. So we have to develop a little bit of intelligence about understanding which types of change are worth swaying for and which ones should be pushed back on. Nothing in these agile methods gets us off the hook of being smart. I had a manager for a while at Solutions IQ who one year his annual goal was suck less. But what he also said, one of his catchphrases was, don't be stupid on purpose. Take advantage of what you can learn from these frameworks, but don't abdicate your own responsibility to be intelligent. Now, that's tricky because this stuff is hard to learn to do well. It's easy to walk out of a certified Scrum Master training and feel like you are now a Scrum Master. Well, you're not. I mean, don't get me wrong, we do certified Scrum Master training and it's good stuff, but A, you're not mastering the Scrum, and B, you're not a master of Scrum when you walk out of that training. It's like when you get out of college. Does it mean you're ready to do your job? No. It means you're ready to begin on-the-job training. How many of you have been through company situations where they brought in Scrum or they brought in Kanban, and after a couple of months, everybody was looking at each other and saying, this is stupid. This doesn't work. And it went nowhere. I'm hearing chuckles and seeing heads nod. So this is a common experience. So what would I say about that? Some things you have to do for a while and get good at them before you're really going to be qualified to express an opinion about whether it works or whether you're doing it wrong. My parents put me in violin lessons when I was in 5th grade. Violin is easy, right? You move your fingers, this is where the notes are, you move the bow up and down. It was horrible. I couldn't stay with it long enough to get good at it. And as a result, I do other things these days, but I don't play the violin. And I think that's a loss. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Scrum. Now, I know this is all familiar territory to some of you, less so to others. Puts me in a little awkward situation. I want to give you enough to have a common basis without dragging the familiar stuff out too long. So I'm going to try and go through this fairly quickly, but give me a signal if you have questions. Raise your hand if I'm going too fast. And if I'm going too slow, deal with it. All right, so you remember I said it's based on a cycle. And you've got the large cycle of the sprint, typically 2 or 3 weeks, and you've got the small cycle of the daily operations. The whole thing begins with the product backlog. This is the ordered list of everything that the team has not started work yet, but is queued up and waiting to be pulled in by the team. The cadence begins with the sprint planning activity in which the team pulls from the top of the backlog enough product backlog items or user stories to reflect the amount of work that they think they can complete in the length of the sprint. And then in many cases, the team goes on to task out each story and to assign estimates to each task. Stories in bulk individually are usually estimated in story points or story counts. How many of you are using story points? How many are using story counts? Story counting is a technique that has started to become popular. If you're able to get your stories small enough that they're all about the same size and very small, you can get good results by just counting them instead of estimating their size. But that's not for beginners. You may think about aspiring to that. In any case, so story points, which are used to assess the size of large backlogs, but then within an individual sprint, tasks, often estimated in hours, and then the team can compare the number of hours they think are in the stories that they've pulled with the number of hours that they think they have, applying all the adjustment factors that we've been hearing about for how many effective hours you think you can work and how many you want to plan as opposed to what slack you want to allow for responsiveness. Every day, the team gets together for no more than 15 minutes. Classical 3 questions: what did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? And what blockers are in my way, keeping me from doing the best job I can? In teams that are pairing, instead of each person saying what I'm going to do, you have a little marketplace where people look for their pairing partners. And in any case, the team has an opportunity then to say, I want to work on this. Can somebody help me? Or, I don't think you really know how to do that, do you, Joe? Can I give you a hand with it? Yikes. Not in a mean way, but in a collaborative spirit that you can have in an effective team. You hold it to 15 minutes with the support of your Scrum Master by not using it for problem solving. The stand-up meeting is not meant to be a time where you find stuff that's wrong and then you proceed to talk about it. Meetings like that go on for a long time, and no wonder people don't like them. What we recommend is you have the basic communication. It's a checkpoint. It's not a status report to management, and it's not a status report to the Scrum Master, God forbid. It's an opportunity for each person on the team to communicate what they believe is going to be useful for the other team members to hear. And as you go through that, you find things that require engineering analysis, problem solving, what have you. You schedule follow-up meetings to do it. You get into the sprint, stand up the daily Scrum, and you get out. At the end of the sprint review, where the working tested software is demonstrated to an audience of stakeholders. You've been demonstrating to your product owner, story by story, as you completed the work. At the end of the sprint, you call a larger meeting together. Team gets an opportunity to take a bow for what they've accomplished. Everybody gets the opportunity to hear feedback about what has been delivered. Team has a retrospective meeting where the team alone sits together and says, what can we do to improve our process? How can we become even more excellent than we are already? And then finally, the actual software is made available. We say potentially shippable, again, to refer to the goal of production quality. Doesn't mean that it necessarily goes into production. It may need to sit and wait until there's enough critical mass to make a usable component, whether it's production or released to web or what have you. And then the feedback that I talked about comes back. What we have learned becomes an opportunity to update the plan for what we're doing in the future. Fairly straightforward. Scrum prescribes 3 roles on a Scrum team. The delivery team, which is development and test, the product owner, who has the responsibility for ordering the product backlog, setting the frame of what's being asked of the team, doing that in a collaborative spirit with a lot of communication with the team. And then finally the Scrum Master, who has the process responsibility and the service responsibility to support and empower the team. Delivery team will have engagement outside the team with SMEs and other teams as needed. Product owner is responsible for facing a whole ecology of stakeholders, possibly end user customers, and so forth. Product owner is a very difficult job because all of these people, every one of these people first. What I want is the most important thing. And in a lot of companies, you have vice presidents who show up and say, no, this is what we're going to do. Sales comes in and says, I just sold this thing. Customer support comes in and says, this is our biggest call driver. We're screaming here. Somebody else comes in and says, we've got a production problem, right? And the product owner is the person who has to interleave all of that stuff into a single priority order so that the team knows what is being asked of them next, and so that that order makes good, coherent sense in the face of everything that's going on. Scrum Master, as I said, has responsibility for supporting the process across the whole space. Talk briefly about some of the artifacts involved. Scrum prescribes a very small number of artifacts. There's the product backlog. There's the sprint backlog, which again is the stories that have been pulled in to scope for the sprint. By the way, this is a batch size. How much work has been brought into the current sprint? Daily stand-up often produces a burn-down chart where the team has an opportunity to see of the hours that we thought we were going to have to do, how much of them are left, do we think we're going to make it, and if not, how can we organize or reorganize ourselves to have the best opportunity of meeting that goal. Working software shown at the sprint review. And at the sprint retrospective, this is actually a data-driven activity. There are 50 or more different ways to do a good retrospective. In fact, one of your local Portland people, Diana Larson, co-author of a very important book called Agile Retrospectives. I encourage any of you who don't know that book to run out and get it. Esther and Diana and Esther Derby co-wrote that book. But in any case, in this illustration, we're looking at an example of stickies that went up on the board. What went well? What could use improvement? Everybody on the team being facilitated effectively to contribute in an open and honest and safe environment. And then finally, the team selecting small number of action items, things that they're going to try to improve what's going on. You may also see impediments come out of this that are recognized that the Scrum Master will put onto their to-do list and go take off to resolve outside the scope of the team. Burn up chart. In this case, the example is a burn up for a release. You can also see this at a sprint level. Little green bars show the amount of completed work increasing day by day over the time period. The black dots at the top show the scope of what's being targeted for the time frame. You can draw a line, fit, projection, and ask yourself, at this rate of progress, for this scope, are we going to get there by the time frame that we're aiming at? Well, if this is the end of the release, the answer is almost. That may be a good result. I want to talk a little further about the potentially shippable product increment. Can you read this, or is that too small? I do not think it means what you think it means. Mandy Patinkin, gotta love him. Let's see. So what is a potentially shippable product increment? I've said several times now, working software at production quality. The definition of done is the artifact that nails down the team's agreements about what standards they're going to hold themselves and each other to. Now, in this example, I've illustrated a number of quality standards that a team might apply at the individual story level. Believe me, this is just an example. What you need could easily be different. So there will be some type of representation about unit tests, functional tests. Code may need to be reviewed. Maybe it's paired. Maybe you have code coverage metrics. Maybe you have static analysis. Whatever's going on, things that you are able to achieve with every individual story. There may be some things that you're only able to do once per sprint. You'll demonstrate in this example, not to the product owner, but to the stakeholders at the end of the sprint. There may be other types of testing that you run only at that interval, documentation, and so forth. You may have a standard that says no defects of Sev 1 or 2 at the story level. If there's any known defect of Sev 1 or 2, the story is not done. We're not going to call it done. We're going to keep working on it till it's fixed. You may, however, have a standard that says you allow 1 cosmetic defect per story. You may have, however, an element in your definition at the sprint level that says no more than 3 cosmetic defects over the entire batch of stories in that sprint. So if you've got 1 in each of 7 stories, you're going to have to fix 4 of them before your sprint is complete. There will also be some things that you can't do until the release level. And we talked about this a little earlier. In a lot of companies, it's very difficult to assemble all of the resources that are needed to control the sadly manual process of testing that's required in multiple interacting systems. Remember this telco that I talked about? Handset ordering system where I was working had to interface with an accounting system and a billing system and a customer database, and it had to talk to those various systems through not 1 but 2 different tiers of middleware, right? And so in order to assemble a release where there was potentially work being done in those other systems that related to the same functionality that was being delivered, you had to get all of the people coordinated. You had to get all of the test data coordinated in all those different systems. It was an utter nightmare. So they had no way to bring that stuff up into the sprint by sprint, much less the story by story testing regime. It was just too expensive. A big effort they had to schedule and handle all at once. Your environments may be more amenable to doing the work at the sprint level, but in general, over time, we want to see all of this stuff migrating as much as possible into the individual story definitions. Here's a concept we call above and below the waterline. This is an example of a definition of done that was put together by a team that was in formation. They put together various ideas for stickies, and they argued about them and negotiated them, and finally ended up with this set of criteria at the sprint level, things like code is complete, unit tests written and passed, no pry1, pry2 bugs, and so forth. Then they recognized that there were some other things that they wanted to do that they weren't capable of stepping up to just yet. Here's one that says profiler. Here's one that says unit test coverage level. Here's one that talks about regression testing. So these items below the waterline indicate an aspirational set of goals for where the team thinks their next phase of maturation lies in improving the definition of done at the story level. Similarly, at the sprint level, they're looking potentially for a bug bash. limited number of probably 3 bugs, and they are looking to mature to that over time. So above and below the waterline. Part of the power of this is that there's a culture of paying attention to these things all the time. I mean, it's not like somebody somewhere in IT management has said, here's the code quality standards, and they publish them on the wiki, and everybody goes, do we have code quality standards? The idea here is to bring that into the daily life and consciousness of the team, and that's where the power comes from. Finally, I want to talk about values I mentioned earlier. Here's Ken Schwaber talking about Scrum values. I would say that the very same things will apply to your Kanban teams if you're looking for high performance. You make a commitment to a goal. You stay focused on what you've committed to do. We have a saying, if it's not in the backlog, it doesn't exist. You want people to be working on things that are outside of the plan. And when you see that happening, you know you've got a problem. You want people to relate to each other with courage and respect. People have to be willing to say, I made a mistake, or I don't know how. I have 2 little pieces of blue sticky tape on my desk back at the office. One of them says, ask for help. The other one says, learn to say no. Well, that's my particular edge, but in any case, the courage to admit when you're wrong, the courage to ask for help, the habits of dealing with each other with respect, and the whole thing is an open process. Everything that happens in Scrum is meant to be visible. Your burn down is visible, not because you have to let your manager micromanage you to it, but because it's data about what's going on. And this whole thing works well in an atmosphere of lots of light and air. So that's openness. The values are fundamental. On top of the values, the principles, on top of the principles, the practices, and then the benefits. But if you try to build this thing without the values at the bottom, your results are going to be very shaky. Okay, so I can pause for a moment now and ask if there are questions about the general commonalities that pertain across these Agile workflow frameworks. Yes? Yes.
Versus sprints. I pull a story into my sprint. So why is there a difference?
All right, the question is, what's the difference between definition of done at the story level and at the sprint level? I pull a story into my sprint, what's the difference? Is that the question? All right, so the idea is this. I will be finishing, or the team will be finishing stories over a 10 or 15-day sprint, finishing stories potentially at any day during the sprint. And the story level definition of done defines the criteria that are supposed to be met when that individual story is called complete. Now, you get to the end of the sprint, there may be some integration testing, there may be some documentation that for whatever reason that team doesn't feel they can do in line with each story. They want to do it in a batch at the end of the sprint. Maybe because that's the only way they know how. Maybe because they think it's more efficient, for whatever reason. So, of course, we would encourage all of that stuff to be brought forward to the story level over time. But at any point in time, the capability of that individual team may be such that some of the attributes happen at story done time. Some of the other attributes happen at sprint or release done time. Okay? There was another question down here, maybe? That was it. Okay. We'll take questions again at the end. I'm happy to move on. All right. Introduction to Kanban. In this example, we're looking at a sample Kanban board with 5 common stages of progress, or as they're called in Kanban, queues. You might call them states or stages, doesn't matter. But any individual piece of work will progress in the default case from left to right until it's done. Kanban will start with you wherever you are. If this set of 5 queues is a good match for how you work, you might start here. If your work is organized a little differently, you can totally set up the board however you like. I'm going to go through with this example for the next few slides. So what do we got here? The open queue. An item in the backlog that has been requested is not necessarily ready to be worked by the team. This corresponds to the stuff in a Scrum backlog that's further down from the top. It may need to be groomed to get clarified, may need to be prioritized. One thing that you have in Scrum is the need to estimate the stories, and you don't have that in Kanban. But in any case, the open queue is like the slush pile of everything is lined up waiting for attention. The ready queue, the items that have been prepared for the team to pull. In progress, of course, anything that has been started by the team. Done, this column reflects everything that the team has said. We have now met the process policy for calling an item done, and it's waiting to be accepted. And in the following column, accepted means that the product owner or other accountable stakeholder has said, yes, this item is finished according to how it's supposed to be done. When you add work in process units, you translate from what would be a Scrum board to what would be a Kanban board. What's a work in process limit? It's a discipline to help the team. The work in process limit is your friend. Think of Shakespeare writing a sonnet. What's a sonnet? Sonnet has to follow a very explicit form. 14 lines, a certain rhyme scheme. And as a kid, if you ever tried to write one, you might say, why do I have to do this? It's too hard. I want to write free verse instead. But Shakespeare, among others, demonstrated the value that can be delivered by compressing yourself into a form. The form can serve you, and in this case, the work in process limit helps maximize your throughput. Don't try to do too many things at once. We touched on this before. The idea is that when the limit is reached, let's look in the ready column, the limit is 2. There are 2 columns, 2 cards in that column. When the limit is reached, no more items can be put into that state. That means that the next open item cannot be pulled into this column and the work started on it. The team is meant to swarm to help relieve the blockage. This is one of the powerful elements of this approach to the work. It doesn't work as well if the members of your team are strictly siloed as to their expertise. If you have people who say, I'm a developer, I don't test, I'm a tester, I don't develop, or I'm a front-end developer, I'm a back-end developer, I'm a front-end tester, I'm a back-end tester, I'm a manual tester, I'm an exploratory tester, I'm a test automation writer. All of those kinds of divisions, those may be very important elements of expertise, but to the degree that your individuals are restricted to those silos, your throughput is going to be impeded. So the idea here is that the team works together to relieve the blockage. And just as you heard from Hillel yesterday, the scan is from right to left. We'll talk about that a little further at the workshop tomorrow. So how do you set a WIP limit? One way to start is you count 1 per team member in your ready queue, 1 per team member in progress, and maybe a half per team member in the done column. These are just starting points. What we suggest is run with it for a couple of weeks, and when you have your retrospective, which by the way, retrospective is not a formal part of Kanban, but it's something that we recommend is added from the Scrum world into the Kanban world. This is an example of how you get a blended Scrumban model. We're going to talk about this also a little further at the workshop tomorrow. But for the moment, just take the retrospective idea, and the 2 rules of thumb that we offer: if you have idle people, that means you have members of the team who are sitting around who can't get in to do any work because the work that's going on already has as many people on it as can be effectively used. And that's a suggestion that the WIP limit may be too low. You increase it, you allow people to stay busy. Now remember, the goal here is to optimize the throughput, not to optimize the utilization. That's a very important mind shift. Nevertheless, you have people who can't be busy because they can't get at the work. That's not good either. If you have, instead of idle people, idle tasks, a work item that goes up on the board and sits in the same column day after day after day, that suggests that the work in process limit is too high and you want to crank it down to get optimal attention to finishing items. Yes?
Why is the work in process limit done? Done just jumps over there, nobody talks about it ever again.
No, that would be accepted or deployed. Done, in this case, there's one piece of work that is remaining to do, which is that the product owner or the other responsible stakeholder, it may be the person who submitted the defect ticket, it may be if this is a Kanban in an IT shop where you're doing service on people's computers, the person who gave you their computer and said, this thing doesn't work anymore. Whoever is the responsible stakeholder, they have to say, yes, you did what I wanted. Once that's done, the item is accepted, and then there is no limit on the accepted column. The idea of putting a limit on done is that it helps focus the team. If you have a product owner who's absent, who's not paying attention, it's going to slow down the operation, and it is a way to focus the team on calling the product owner's attention to what they need to do to support the team. Can you please take a look at this thing? Is there anything we can do to help you evaluate the work that we just did on this story? Type of thing. Let's talk a little bit about process policies. In Scrum, we talked about definition of done. That's like one policy that controls the progression of an item from in progress to done. In Kanban, that can be a little further articulated. You may have a policy that defines what has to be true in order for an item to move from open to ready. It may be that you want to say if the external dependencies are not met, we're not going to pull it. That, by the way, is often a smart idea in a Scrum team as well. Otherwise, it's like a game of are you feeling lucky, punk? You're waiting for somebody outside your team to deliver a wireframe, or to tell you what the business rules are, or to do a legal review on the copy, or to provide you an interface for something that you don't want to code to a stub for whatever reason. Any of these types of external dependencies, you may decide you're not going to pull that thing in progress unless the dependency is already met. Then you know it's not going to block you midstream. Something like that is called a definition of ready, and you sometimes see that in a Scrum team as well. What do you have to have in terms of the story definition before the team will say, this feels good enough that we can start? Transition from in progress to done, definition of done, and the transition from done to accepted is that it's approved, as I said, by the stakeholders. Now, the term acceptance criteria, which is common in the user story world, you see that more often in Scrum than you do in Kanban, but it's certainly applicable here as well. Remember the distinction that I drew between doing the right thing and doing the thing right. The acceptance criteria, which define the scope of what's being delivered in that item, that's doing the right thing. And the definition of done, which defines the quality standards for all items of a particular type, that's doing the thing right. We look to the team in question who's using this board to set these policies for themselves and hold themselves and each other to it. Now, you can have swim lanes in a Kanban situation to reflect the fact that not all items that show up are created equal. You'll have a regular queue, standard items, that you pull in order. It may be a FIFO order. It may be an order that's established by a product owner in negotiation. But those are the items that you routinely deliver according to your capacity. Sometimes an item will show up that has to be delivered by the 31st of the month, otherwise there'll be a regulatory penalty. Or we have to get this feature in for such and such a customer. If we can do it by the end of May, they'll buy $12 million worth of the product. Now, these are sometimes examples of things that can be considered as fixed date items, where the cost of delay is low as long as you meet the deadline, and then suddenly becomes very high if you miss the deadline. You can expedite work of that kind by putting it into its own lane and giving it permission to temporarily violate the WIP limit while you finish it. At the very top, we see expedited items, and these are things that just have to be done immediately. Major production failures typically in this category. And again, the operating concept is everybody on the team drops what they're doing, swarms on this item, figures out what the optimum arrangement is for who's going to work on it. Once that's set, everybody else goes back to what they were doing, and the expediting team pushes through again with temporary permission to violate the work limit. Yep. That's an excellent question. Would you consider violating the WIP limit, or would you consider leaving slack in order to allow for that type of work to emerge when it needed? And I would say the answer to that is it depends. If you live in an environment, I'll get you next, if you live in an environment where you have a certain predictable level of that kind of disruption, but you don't know in advance when it's going to hit or which items are going to hit, you may want to allow slack specifically for that purpose. In other cases where the items are rare and irregular and unpredictable, you may need slack for other reasons, but not specifically for this. Yep.
Yeah, sorry to beat this one up, but I would think that you would move the item back to make space for it.
Some teams do that. It's not a practice that I favor, and the reason for that is severalfold. One is it messes up your statistics. It gets very confusing to understand how long something took if you're changing its state in the reverse direction. Another reason is it brings the visibility of the problem down lower, and it tends to mask the dysfunction. One of the things that both Scrum and Kanban are good at is unmasking dysfunction, showing you where the bottlenecks and the issues are in the system. They won't fix them for you, but they give you some data from which you can learn and adapt your operation. If you take a situation like that and just move the item back to the ready queue so that you can handle something else that came along with a higher priority, that masks the fact that you had work in process, you've created waste, and it does not support the overarching goal of improving the system. That said, there's nothing in this that tells you how you have to do it. If you want to move it back to your open queue, do that and see how it works out for you. This is a cumulative flow diagram. It's a close relative of the burn up diagram that we saw in Scrum. Down in this bottom blue segment, we show the continuing increase of number of completed items over time. Above that, the gray section shows items that are implementation. You see this band stays just about the same thickness all the way through. That suggests that the team that did this work is following their WIP limits. That's what we like to see. And then up above that is a section for work that's in design. That's a little bit more irregular. It's hard to know exactly what's going on without having a conversation with the team. You might, in theory, also have another band at the top of this that portrays the open queue or the ready queue. And by the way, if that one is growing faster than the work is being completed, then you know you've got a mismatch between what's being asked of the team and what the team is capable of delivering. That's very important data. You can use that to say, how can we drive the inefficiencies out of our process? You can use that to go to management and say, dude, we got 3 times as much stuff here as we're capable of doing. It's time to add another team. This bar at the bottom, this bar at the bottom, which shows the completed work, is just like the bar that shows the completed work in a release burn-up. This diagram just gives you the extra information of the additional bands. But one other thing I want to say about this, you'll notice the 3 steps in this diagram: design, implement, and done. That's kind of waterfall-y. I would hope that none of you are stuck in that kind of world. But it illustrates the fact that Kanban will start with you wherever you are. It doesn't require the same kinds of abrupt changes to your method of process as it takes to start in Kanban. If you're doing waterfall work with small items, model that in your Kanban system and then use the data you get from that experience to improve that process. This is a control chart. This is the other classical type. Yes?
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so just trying to understand the slide a little better. It sounds like the design and implement are just sort of temporary, temporal phases that the card is going through.
They would be columns on the board in this example.
Right, but your done is really the cumulative one.
Yep.
And so if you did have the ready, it would just be like, okay, on, I guess, day 1, we got a new ready. On day 6, we got 6 more readies. So you can see a little spike. But would that ready be also cumulative like that is?
Well, no, not exactly. Let's go back and look at the board here. You've got an open column and a ready column. And actually, we've suggested work in process limit on the ready column and no work in process limit on the open queue. Let's talk about that for a minute. The items that are requested that come in, before you have a chance to digest them and make them ready to be consumed by the team, that's a list that can be of any arbitrary size. And if that list is growing over time, it means that you're being asked to do things faster than you're able to complete them. If you're in a steady state, the arrival rate equals the completion rate. So in your diagram, if you had the open column as the top band on that stacked chart, you would expect to see in a steady state environment that retains a steady size. You might have 30 items in there, and then over the course of a month you'd finish 15, you'd get 15 new ones, right? So that would be the thickness, the height of that band might be 30 over the course of time. Now, if it's growing faster, you can see that in the chart, right? And that shows you that your arrival rate, right. Now, the other thing though is that the ready column, why is there a work in process limit on the ready column? For much the same reason that we have the principle of progressive elaboration in Scrum. We say that in a Scrum backlog, the items at the top should be smaller and more highly groomed and ready to consume because they're the ones you're going to get to first. But you don't address that much attention to the items that are farther down in the backlog because you won't get to them for a while. By the time you get there, you're going to know more. Priorities may be different, the needs may be different, and the grooming you'd have to do to it would be different. So to groom too far ahead of time would be to create waste. In this situation, we put a limit on the ready column for a similar reason. There's no need to groom up too many stories and get them ready. All you need is enough to be able to pull from to keep the team fed. Right? And in that case, you would expect the ready column to be a band of constant thickness. All right, let's go ahead and come back here. I thought of one more thing I wanted to talk about here. The size of a work item, of a story, typically in Scrum is measured in story points. This is an estimate that you do ahead of time about the relative size of a piece of work compared to the other pieces of work that you're doing. You don't typically have that in Kanban. Although it can be a useful enhancement, it's not a part of the fundamental system. Kanban does not rest on estimates ahead of time. What you have instead are two measures that are called the lead time and the cycle time. The cycle time generally refers to the amount of time it takes from when you begin working on the item till when you finish it. Lead time is the amount of time from when they ask you to do it until when you finish it. And you can assess that by doing lateral measurements in this chart. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but those are the two fundamental measures. How fast do you do an item? How many items you do in a period of time is the throughput. So here's a control chart. In this diagram, each of these little green dots refers to the completion of one or more items of work. This axis is date. The vertical axis is how long it took to finish each item on the chart. So here's an item that was done in very little time. Here's an item that took 35 days to complete, but these were all finished on the same day. So in this particular chart, which happens to come from JIRA, the red bar shows you an average, the blue bar shows you a rolling average, and the blue shaded area shows the standard deviation as it varies over time. So one of the important goals of any of these systems is predictability. You have a backlog of stuff in Scrum. How long is it going to take to build all these features? You have something that shows up in your queue in Kanban. When am I going to get the finished result? Well, if you just said, well, on average it takes 10 days, that's pretty useless because you can see from the data, most of the items are a lot faster or slower than that. The rolling average is a little bit better, but the standard deviation shows you that there's a lot of variability even with that. Well, as you take a closer look at this data, you may notice that there are bands of similar work items. Here's a bunch of stuff that clusters down in the bottom, and this looks like in the day or two, And if you can look at these and say, oh, I know what these were, this is a particular type of work that we do, then you may be able to say to your stakeholders who show up with this kind of work, on average, 80% of the time we finish this kind of thing in 2 days or less. That becomes the basis for a service level agreement. You can see in this example here, there's a mid-range of data, maybe there's a bunch of medium-sized items, and maybe there's some items that cluster here at the high end. Now, I did this by eyeball. Not terribly reliable in this case because you'll notice this is a log scale. And in this batch of items that look kind of similar at the top, they really range from 10 days up to 35 days. So you want to be careful doing that by eyeball, but the data is there and you'll be able to do the analysis. If you can become familiar with the type of work that flows in, and classically what your experience shows you about how long different types of items take, then you have the basis for an open and predictable relationship with your requesting users. All right, what are some of the indicators that will help you identify whether Scrum or Kanban is a better choice in your situation? This is also something we're going to go into in more detail tomorrow, but for the moment, briefly, Scrum. One of the advantages of Scrum is that everybody marches on a fixed cadence. There are situations where teams really benefit from having the discipline of being expected to deliver completed work every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks. By the way, I see people taking pictures here. I want to comment that this is in the proceeding. I'm happy for you to take pictures if you want. This is in the proceedings, and this deck has been updated a little bit from the version that is in the proceedings. Also the paper. So if you'd like updated copies of those, come see me after and give me your email address. I'll be happy to send you an updated original. So if the cadence gives you a helpful forcing function, discipline for the team. Cases where your stories are not too big are good to handle in Scrum. Now, very big stories can mean one of two things. Either it can mean you just aren't very good yet at splitting them, and that's not meant to be disrespectful. It's hard to learn to do a good job at splitting stories from large into small. So when you're looking at your workflow and you're seeing a bunch of things that look very big, you have to stop and say, is this something that I can learn to make smaller? In some cases, there's work that is just resistant to that. You know, that example of building an automobile, for example, it's hard to know how you would split that into vertical slices the way we like to see in software. There are other cases that I've heard of where it is felt that the work is just too large to break up into stories. Frankly, none of those have been persuasive enough to me for me to be able to retain them. So I can't really give you any examples. My guidance is, in general, if you think your work items are too big, invest some time in really learning to think about how to make them smaller. And although that story splitting is not in scope for today or tomorrow, if you're interested in that, come see me and I'll give you some ideas about that. In any case, if the story is too big, it's not going to work well in Scrum because you want your stories to be finished within a sprint timeframe. You have to be able to understand enough about the item to estimate it. Classically, of course, in the case of defects, this is very difficult to do. You get a bug report that comes in, you don't know what the root cause is, you may have repro instructions that don't work, there may be 3 systems involved, and who knows how the responsibilities are going to fall out. So hard to estimate defects in a Scrum context. If the work items vary a great deal, Scrum is good. If the organization is ready to take a step to reorient the way their teams are operating also, because if not, it's going to be difficult to get good results from Scrum. The secret, of course, that any of you who are working with Scrum have probably learned or are starting to learn is that the success factors only partially reside inside the individual team. To a great extent, they reside in the holding environment. And if the organization isn't ready to adapt to meet the requirements, relationships between the business and the developers, for example, one classical area that's difficult. So the organization has to be ready for it. Now, Kanban, on the other hand, if you're looking at something that looks like a continuous flow of work items, that immediately should ring bells and suggest Kanban for you. If the items are small, if they're repetitive, or If they're bigger and you threw up your hands about doing them with Scrum because you didn't know how to break them down, you can resort to Kanban as an approach. Although I will say in that situation, you want to avoid having one big blocky item sit in the middle of your work in progress for 3 weeks and just obstruct the whole deal. If you're dealing with that kind of situation, you may want to break the work item into tasks and move the tasks across your board. You may want to further articulate the cues in your system in order to be able to see progress and understand that there's movement happening. If you have items that you're expected to deliver immediately or at arbitrary intervals, Kanban may be a better choice than Scrum. In Scrum, as you may know, it's oriented to delivering the complete package of all the stories you've built together at the end of each sprint. And a mid-sprint delivery can be accommodated within Scrum, but it's not natural. And a lot of teams don't relate well to that type of practice. In Kanban, on the other hand, it's perfectly natural. If the priorities are changing rapidly, you may want to be in a Kanban environment instead of Scrum. In Scrum, you're going to be pulling a package of work for a 2-week or 3-week period. And if your organization is not able to hold still long enough for you to finish 2 blinking weeks of work, you may want to say, okay, we'll try something different. Now, again, sometimes that variation is just motivated by managers who cannot keep their eye on the ball. They run around with their hair on fire. You've got production defects. I have got a client who has a team who said to me, yeah, 60% of our time is spent dealing with production defects. I mean, what are you going to do? Well, I'll tell you what you're going to do. If you're committed to Scrum, in that kind of environment, you create a big fat buffer and you flow your defects through it. It's not ideal. It's difficult to get optimal throughput when you're reserving time in different buffers. But in any case, if the priorities are changing quickly in Kanban, it's easier. You don't have to plan ahead over what is currently in progress at all. Now, if the team is getting jerked around by continued and repeated changes of direction, it's going to be disorienting no matter what kind of system you're in. But it'll be a little bit easier to deal with in Kanban. It's more natural. And I would say finally, if the organization wants to make progress in small increments, then Kanban is a good way to go because, as I've said, it'll start with you wherever you are rather than requiring you to establish roles and cadences and so forth. All right, I would like you to take, no, you know what? I'm going to hold this because we're running a little bit late. So now having introduced Scrum and Kanban and talked about the benefits of the two systems and how to think about the differences between them, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the mixed Scrum and Kanban designs that I have seen. When I set out to create this presentation, I thought, all right, well, I got to see what I can pull from my bag of tricks, what I've actually seen out there in the wild. And I surprised myself by it took almost no time to come up with half a dozen examples of different models of how Kanban and Scrum were being used together. Now we start to get here. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about blended designs where some of the characteristics of Scrum can be used together with Kanban in a single process. This is talking about mixed processes that use some Scrum and some Kanban together. So the first example, which I saw in a telco, actually this was the one that I was talking about earlier, rotating defect teams. Feature work for the next release was being put through the Scrum teams A, B, and C, while Team D was working on defects from a somewhat overlapped hardening period from the previous release that was being prepared for delivery. I ran this Kanban team. By the end of the 6 weeks, we had a wall with, I'm thinking it was about 600 little tickets representing the completed defects that we had processed on this team. Appalling that there was that much work. But the next release was down to about 1/10 of that. So in this case, all of these teams working in the same application system area 3 of them working on the new stuff, 1 team working on defects, and then in order to avoid keeping 1 team in defect jail perpetually, they would rotate that assignment with successive releases. This worked out very well. You had the advantage of the work that you could not estimate flowing naturally through the Kanban workflow, and you had the advantage of being able to keep several of the Scrum teams focused on the next phase of development, and the advantage of being able to keep the fixed work in the zone of the people who had the expertise to deal with it. Now, a lot of those 600 tickets turned out to be resolved. Not my problem, no repro, won't fix, what have you, but when there was work that needed to be done, these were the people with the domain expertise, and they were able to handle it very efficiently. It also kept the sense of responsibility in the zone, and people got to see the results of their own work or the work that their teammates had done in earlier time frames. Very powerful. Software company, in this case a firm in Seattle. I call this the defect sub-team model. This particular company is organized in feature teams. They had about 30 feature teams, each containing 1 or more Scrum teams. And in this case, they partitioned themselves into a Scrum team and a Kanban team. Most of the defect flow going through the Kanban team, some defect overflow flowing along with the features into the Scrum team. And the Scrum team managed their planning by allocating a reserve buffer for dealing with a predictable level of defect disruption. Here's an energy company that I worked with in Texas. These people were working in an ERP context, so they were doing system control by parameter rather than by programming for the most part. They did have a flow of projects and enhancements. They split them up by size, several Scrum teams doing the large and the medium ones, and then the tiniest items went into a Kanban flow along with service tickets, and defects were handled by a Kanban team. Another software company. This was the e-commerce division of this particular company, and they had a number of fairly complex web properties that they were responsible for, and they handled new features on a project release basis through a series of teams, and they had enough daily release work, which included things like price changes and text changes and image changes and minor layout changes, and in some cases setups for simpler A/B testing. All of that drove through the Kanban teams, and they have enough to keep several Kanban teams busy on multiple continents. Another telco that I worked with, they're organized, their software development in pods. Each pod starts with a definition team, and the definition team fills the role that's conventionally filled by the role of product owner. In this case, they had a triumvirate. They had 1 business lead, 1 technical lead, and 1 engineering lead, technical lead and UX lead, the 3 of them together acting as a product owner team, or in this case, as we call them, a definition team. Their job was to create the stories and get them ready and groomed so that the Scrum teams could consume them. And this pod system was oriented according to a rubric that's known as flow to ready, iterate to done. You had a continuous flow through the story preparation process, filling up the backlogs that were then made available for the Scrum teams to pull in an iterative manner. This one I call fantasy football, and I should really have it in quotes. This is not the software people who do the actual fantasy football. I just called it that because this is like a dream arrangement that I don't have a client yet who's been willing to sign up to do this, but I think it makes a lot of sense. What's going on here? Scrum teams with systemic external dependencies where they might need, as I suggested earlier, there may be a UX group that has to produce a wireframe for them. And we know there's a lot of advantage to having that done within the Scrum team. In this case, they were relying on the external expertise. It might be an external copy editing group or a legal group or what have you. What I'm suggesting here is that if those external service groups can set themselves up as Kanban teams with transparency about their queues and with service level agreements based on statistics that they've generated from their own operation, it creates a much more predictable environment to work in, and the expectation is that will improve the throughput substantially. This is in contrast with the situation that's more common where you need something from somebody and either they'll assign you somebody maybe, or you need them, they're not there, you ask them to do something, it disappears, you don't know whether they're working on it or not or how long it's going to take. This type of arrangement is designed to bring transparency and predictability into that process. So, take questions again. We're getting to the end for this morning. I have either put you to sleep or totally satisfied you. Yes?
In those models, individual team members are never on a Scrum team and a Kanban team at the same time. Is that right?
It works best when you don't have to deal with that. However, in the real world, we often see people assigned to multiple teams, and it slows everything down. It's expensive, it's wasteful, but so you have to deal with it sometimes. Tomorrow at the workshop, we're going to play some simulation games in Scrum and Kanban and Scrumban. We're going to have some fun doing that. We're going to look at some of the opportunities to bring useful elements of Scrum across with your Kanban to create a blended Scrumban design. We're going to help you look at the workflow requirements in your own operations and give you an opportunity to do some sketching to design workflows that might work for you. So hope to see some of you tomorrow, and thank you very much for today.